If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Just a few messages before we get started today. And the first thing is something I really hate talking about, but that's to do with money. And you may have noticed that there's been an advert or two on some of my podcasts asking if you can donate. So if you can spare a small amount of money, unfortunately the minimum is £5. I'm trying to lower it, but at the moment the minimum is £5 that you can donate on the GoFundMe page. That would be absolutely amazing. I really appreciate it. Absolutely anything that people could give, no matter how small it is. There's no obligation, of course. And in fact, every single episode of the Sociology Show podcast in the future will continue to be free. It's just if you can spare it. But as I said, absolutely no obligation at all. And that brings me on to the second point. One of the people that has sponsored the show is Ben Hewitson, and Ben runs the All Sociology Take One podcast. If you haven't listened to it, please do go and give it a listen. He does loads and loads of stuff on Instagram as well. Lots of quizzes that students get involved in on Kahoot. He has sort of over 100 people joining in the quizzes each week. So do check out his stuff. The most recent podcast that he just did, I thought was absolutely brilliant. It was all about rave culture, how rave music started, how the government tried to stop it, and he also layers it in with lots of sociology and theory on top of that as well. So absolutely brilliant podcast. Really enjoyed listening to it. So do go and find it. Same place that you get this pod, you'll probably be able to find that one. The All Sociology Take One podcast. Please do check that one out. And so on to this episode. My guest for this one was Dr. Mark Doidge from the University of Brighton. And Mark researches absolutely anything to do with football culture, football fans, and also ultra culture. And Mark's work, his ethnographic research, has taken him to Italy, into Poland, into Germany, into other parts of Europe, and back round to looking at fan culture within the English game as well. Mark is originally from Devon, supported Plymouth as a young boy. Since moving to Brighton, he's been following a local team. No, not Brighton and Hove Albion. A little smaller team known as White Hawk FC, who are from the east side of Brighton. A real small kind of community club who are doing some amazing, fantastic things for the local community. So I really enjoyed chatting to Mark, not just because we're from the same city and also have a love of football, but also just with his passion of what he's done in the past, learning everything that he can about fan culture and how the game really does bring people together. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, my name's Mark Doidge and I'm a Principal Research Fellow at the University of Brighton.
Thank you, Mark. And what's your background in sociology?
Well, my background's slightly unusual, I think, in that I came to sociology very late. If I'm brutally honest, I didn't actually know what sociology was until I started a PhD in it. Okay. I think I've always been a sociologist because I've always seen the world in a certain way, slightly critical, slightly unsure of how the different sections of society link together. But it's also partly about where I grew up in Devon, trying to work out my own place in the world. And one of the ironies of sociology, I think, is that you understand yourself as an individual by understanding the world around you and the society that you grew up in and the society that you live in. So for me, sociology has felt like a natural fit. I came to it very late. I originally studied law at university because I could argue with my parents, and they said I should be a lawyer. And it felt like, as the first person from my family to ever go to university, it felt like a sensible thing to do. And I went into law for all the wrong reasons, because I wanted to help people, and I realised very quickly that, with all due respect to solicitors and barristers, that many going in to make money off other people's misery, like crime, divorce, death, etc. And the people on my course, they seem to be all about how much money they were going to make rather than how many people they were going to help. So I sort of felt disillusioned, and I came from Devon, and the factory that my dad and my granddad had worked in, I'd worked in for a couple of summers, and I just wrote to them, so wrote a letter rather than actually an email, because this was before emails, and said, can I come back for the summer? And I did, and then that job became permanent. I worked in a factory for 10 years, and it was only when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, 2001 that I was effectively realising that there's a big wide world out there, and other factors are making a difference on my life. We'll sort of come on to it a bit later, but it was sort of an excellent example of what C. Wright Mills calls the sociological imagination, which I didn't know at the time, and would have really helped me at the time to make sense of it and to help my colleagues. But it was that sense of, well, the redundancies are personal troubles, but there's actually a public issue here, which was jobs being moved to China, deregulation of the economy, globalization, for want of a better word. And I didn't really understand that, but I was lucky. I took redundancy. I went back to university, studied classics and ancient history because I wanted to be Indiana Jones, and that didn't work. Well, it did. I mean, I loved it. I studied in Rome, which was like one of my dreams, but I didn't fit in. I didn't feel comfortable. And it was when speaking to an archaeologist friend of mine there, and she said, well, what do you like doing? And I said, well, I like writing about sport. And I went, could I write about sport in the modern world? And I went through every department at Plymouth and Exeter universities, because I lived in Devon and couldn't get my head out of Devon. And there happened to be a professor of sociology at Exeter University called Anthony King, who studied football fans. And I had this project in my head, which I'd had for a while, about political football fans and ultras in Italy. And I approached him and he said, yeah, let's go for it. And I was like, yep. And that was my sort of awakening of what sociology was. And it's the best thing I ever did. And I wish I'd done it many, many, many moons ago. I wish I'd had the opportunity to learn it at school. I wish I'd done it as an undergraduate, but I am here now.
Brilliant. That's a long, winding road to get there. You just mentioned Anthony King. Was there anyone else that really influenced you, particularly in that area of kind of sport and sociology?
I'll be brutally honest. I did all the things that you shouldn't do as a potential PhD student, which was I happened to find the person most geographically proximate to me, as opposed to the best person for me based on extensive research. As it happened, Anthony King was easily the best person I could have worked with. I just didn't realise it, and I hadn't done all the background research that I should have done. However, I did engage with some sociological studies in my master's, writing about ancient sport, in particular Eric Dunning's work and the figuration lists, the sort of understanding sport violence, football hooliganism, which I did incorporate into my work on fans of ancient games and violence in ancient sports. But I didn't really know what sociology was before I started. But Tony King said, right, okay, this is your apprenticeship. He basically said, go off and read Marx, Weber and Durkheim and give yourself a grounding. And I read them and was like, wow. There's no way I could ever have synthesized it, but naively I tried to, which was never going to work. But it gave me a grounding, and it was like, wow, okay. And particularly as someone who studies, or part of my research is on football fans, Durkheim definitely resonated, because it's particularly late Durkheim rather than the more structuralist stuff, but elementary forms of religious life, which is about the rituals that bring about a community, that bring about a group and a sense of identity, which obviously through football we can see the ritualistic approach to going to a stadium every 2 weeks, to seeing the sacred colours, the sacred badge, even the totemic players that are elevated up into celebrity status, as well as what we desecrates the symbols of our rivals, and we see how those symbols become a sense of who we are as a fan as opposed to who they are. And that was quite an important sort of grounding for me. But then obviously I started reading around hooliganism, which is the groundings of football fan studies. It's subcultural studies, so Stuart Hall and people like that, talking about youth subcultures. But equally then into the more political economic stuff, so understanding people like Gramsci, but also understanding globalization from that sense, because to understand modern football, contemporary football, you have to understand how global finance, global marketing, global sponsorship, global corporations, global migration of players and managers all operate in a global televised media landscape. So that was all quite an important grounding.
Thank you. Yeah. And let's get more into your research then. So did you say your first research into football fan culture was in Italy?
Yeah, so my PhD was on Italian football fans, and it was effectively to try and understand political football fans. Football Awakening in Italy really came about from a Channel 4 TV show called Football Italia.
Yeah.
The Premier League had just formed in 1992, and Channel 4 got the rights to Serie A, which at the time was the best league in the world and had the best players. And there was also something about the production that Channel 4 brought, which was James Richardson sitting in a piazza reading these Italian papers with a cup of coffee and a croissant. I was like, this is like so stylish. And for a boy from Devon, it was like, wow, these guys look so cool. But also it was an opportunity to watch free football on the television. We didn't have Sky, and I didn't watch Sky. And to a certain extent, I probably politically, as I do now, don't agree with the fact that it's separated and that the people can't watch football in that way. So that was my big awakening. But then it was also partly seeing all the fans, the noise. It was very different from what I was seeing in Britain. Now, I grew up as a Plymouth Argyle fan, and from what I can remember as a kid, it was in the 1980s, it was noisy, there was songs, and it was a large group of people in one place, but it didn't feel as coordinated as the ultras, which are big choreographies with banners, with even big, huge sheets that cover the entire length or the entire width of the stand with images drawn on them. The chanting and the singing is much more coordinated, and it just felt incredible. And plus, they also seem to have a political agenda, which British fans don't tend to have. I mean, there are some groups who would be engaged in what I call football politics, so complaining about their owners or about governance issues, or maybe engaging in things like anti-racism, anti-homophobia. But it wasn't necessarily ideological politics. And in Italy, they did, because there were some groups like the Irriducibili at Lazio who were explicitly fascist. And I went to study a group of fans in Livorno who had explicitly left-wing communist fans. And part of my research was about understanding why these political identities endure, because a lot of Italian fans and a lot of ultras groups have become apolitical, or effectively only fighting football politics, but some of them are still ideological. So it was just very different from Britain in every way. And then you realise when you get there that it's actually not that different. Football's still quite mundane. It's part of everyday people's lives. People talk about it when they go to the cafes and bars. It's a part of the similar sort of rituals of going to a bar before going to the stadium and things like that. So, yeah, the great thing about studying football is that it gives you an opportunity to study something that is universal. So you can see how things are similar and different from across history and across the world. And that's really useful.
Because I was going to ask you, there is an association of the word ultras. traditionally to be more right-wing and fascist, as you said, isn't there? I know that's not completely true, but a lot of people do think of that idea of ultras as tied up with right-wing politics.
Yeah, I think that's a media construction. I think there's 2 or 3 media constructions, one of them being that they're political and that they invariably are from the right, and also that they are violent. And the other one is that they wield undue power. They're all media and political constructions, which vary from group to group. So my most recent book, so sort of to come back to your earlier question, my first research was on Italian football fans, which sort of grew into understanding and thinking about political football fans across Europe. So I've done some research in Poland and Germany as well, and also Britain. But the most recent book is about ultras, which tries to identify that actually these are heterogeneous groups. Football fans are heterogeneous. The idea that all football fans are the same is sociologically unsound, and majority of people who like to present it that way are usually doing so for some political reason, and usually to criticise football fans as opposed to actually celebrate the diversity that's there. But ultras in particular are incredibly heterogeneous, still overwhelmingly masculine, and I think that's fair to say. But some groups are apolitical, some groups are explicitly, instrumentally political, some will be nationalistic. So, and in some countries, in Poland, for example, and some of the Eastern Europe, there is nationalism within the terraces. But then, as we've just seen, Poland's just re-elected a nationalistic president. So is it unsurprising that there's nationalism on the terraces? I mean, those two things are connected. In Germany, football fans, they are a little bit more actively involved in their club in some ways, partly because a lot of them are members and own their, and have a voice within their clubs. And broadly speaking, a lot of ultras groups in Germany are to the left, but then there's equally right-wing groups. There's the rise of AfD, the far-right party in Germany. So you're not going to be surprised if there's football fans who also identify with those political parties. In Italy, you had Irreducibili, or you had Verona, who had groups who were explicitly right-wing, but then equally you have Tanana, Livorno, Cosenza, which would be seen as left-wing football fans. But equally, even within a terrace, within a stadium, there are different ultras groups. So they will vie for positions of power and who is the dominant one. But you'll have lots of little groups, and in some cases, you'll have left and right-wing groups within the same curva in the same stadium, because during the match, the most important thing is the team and how they play, not the politics of the different groups.
So how did you conduct your research then, Mark? Were you doing observation or conducting interviews? How are you actually gaining your info?
Yeah, so for my PhD in particular, it was predominantly ethnographic work. So it was spending 6 months in Livorno, spending time with fans, a large part of it trying to understand what is Italian society and Italian culture and how football fits into that. It was also just getting completely flooded with, an understanding what it means to be Italian and trying to live as an Italian. I think that's the beauty of ethnographic work, is to try to see the world through the people that you're researching, see it through their eyes. And being able to sort of live in that space was incredibly difficult. It was amazing fun. Yes, there was a lot of amazing food and nice wine and talking about football and watching football. And Livorno is a beautiful city by the beach. So, sometimes to really understand the fans, I had to go and sit on the beach and enjoy the sunshine, just like the other fans did. But it was also it was also difficult when you're trying to make sense of everything and what you think is a familiar culture. I've been to Italy numerous times, but to actually live there, to try and ingratiate yourself in with a group of people. But the Livornese were amazing people. And I think what it really showed me, the difference between going somewhere as a tourist when you go to look at the beautiful art or the beautiful buildings or have the beautiful food or the beautiful landscape of Italy, when actually the people themselves are the most important thing. And realising this as a sociologist is quite important, is people are what makes communities, what makes society, not everything else that's around. So yeah, I also did interviews. So once you get to know people, you start interviewing people. So some of these would be classed as ethnographic interviews, where you're just having a conversation on the terrace, but you record it in a notebook afterwards. And some of them are more structured, where you're sitting down in a bar or a social space and just having a conversation and recording it so you can transcribe it later. Most of my later work has been interviews, but obviously there is an ethnographic element to it, which is participant observation in stadiums. So yeah, again, I'm very lucky. I get funding to go and watch some games around Europe and speak to football fans. So I'm very, very lucky there.
That's the dream, isn't it, Mark?
Well, it's definitely my dream, yeah.
So you said Italy, Poland. Where else have you studied fan culture?
Poland, Italy, Germany, Britain. So, I mean, most of my work now, and it's sort of how to differentiate between being a fan and being an academic. We're both based in Brighton, and you're aware of Whitehawk. So I'm a fan of Whitehawk. What I mentioned earlier is I said I grew up as a fan of Plymouth Argyle, and one of those truisms of football is that you have one football team for life. And yes, I'm an Argyle fan, but I live in Brighton now, have done for 8 years. And something changes when you go to, you engage in the rituals in a slightly different way. And for me, it was 5 years ago that I went to my first game. I'd heard about this team, non-league football team. They were in National South at the time. And I'd heard that they had an ultras group. And I was like, well, that's interesting. It's on my doorstep. I probably should go up. And I remembered I was supervising a master's student from Indonesia at the time who'd come over to research the activism of Brighton Hove Albion fans back when they were kicked out of the Goldstone ground and were trying to move back to Falmouth. So she'd heard about that in Indonesia and wanted to speak to some of the people there. And I was having a tutorial with her, and her boyfriend was visiting her, and he was studying in Italy. And he loved football, and he was talking about the ultras in Italy. And I said, oh, yeah, my research was in Italy. And they said, oh, there's a football team near us called Whitehall. We've seen it on a sign. I said, oh, yeah, I've heard that there's some interesting things there. Yeah, if you want to go up, I'll go up. And we agreed to go to the first match of the season. It was a Tuesday night, slightly drizzling. It was, of course, it's August in summer in Britain. And I'm walking up through East Brighton Park and thinking, I've got no idea where I'm going. I hope this is safe. I had no idea whether it would be safe. I'm bringing 2 Indonesians along. Is this going to be okay? And met them outside the turnstiles. They brought their Japanese flatmate with them. We walked through we paid, went to the turnstiles. Someone approaches us and says, oh, welcome to Whitehawk. If you want to go over to the other end there, that's where all the fun is. And that's where the ultras were singing. And I said to the people I was with, they said, oh, no, we'll stay here. And then another guy who used to work on the door there, Len, a big sort of typical Whitehawk guy, comes up and he goes, oh, if you ever want to bring any of your students up to Whitehawk, you're welcome anytime. Just come up, it's great to see you. And I was like, oh, what a really friendly place from just those opening moments. And then you realise that's what football's about. And what I've realised about Whitehawk is, I like the football and they play pretty good football, but actually there's just really nice people there. And those are the bits that you actually want to see. But that was 5 years ago. And I can remember thinking at the time, if I'm still here in February when it's freezing cold, then something's changed. And I was still there in February, and I'm still there 5 years later and getting more involved. And this is where sort of the sociological imagination kicks in, is that there's a group of fans who are doing some great things. So we raise collections for food banks. We've had Refugees Welcome Day. We're very openly anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic. In fact, I think they're the only fans I've ever heard openly sing against sexism. But then equally, there's, how do we turn that into helping the local community? And sort of my research into things like clubs in the community, football in the community schemes. So we set up a Hawks in the community last year. And it's just sort of getting slightly involved into doing these positive community-orientated works that benefit the football club, but also, reinforce that the club is part of the community and brings people together, especially recently with COVID-19. After this, that's when people are going to want to come together, and why football will be quite important in all that.
Yeah, I think we should give the listeners a bit of context about Whitehawk. As you said, we both live in Brighton. I'm a Brighton fan. Premier League team, big Premier League team. But people might not be aware there is two teams in Brighton. And when I don't go and watch Brighton, I do go and watch Whitehawk, which, what are we talking? Maybe 200-300 fans for a game? Maybe a few more. If it's
300 to 400, yeah.
300-400. And Whitehawk itself it's improved, but it's probably the poorest area of Brighton, isn't it?
Well, up until a few years ago, it was the poorest place in southern Britain.
Yeah.
So, I mean, poverty is relative, and obviously around it is relatively affluent because of Brighton and Sussex. But yeah, when I first moved to Brighton, there was this stigma about Whitehawk, this estate on the east of Brighton. And I must admit, when I first was going over, that sort of sticks in your mind. And yet when I've been into Whitehawk, it's like, oh, this is just like the estate where I grew up in Devon, and it's just a housing estate on the edge of a seaside town, which most of the people there I've met have been really lovely. So, yeah, it's just this how poverty and particularly working class communities get stigmatised in certain ways as being dangerous. And I'm new to the area, so I don't know legacies and histories, but it's pretty obvious that that's part and parcel of the story there.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we're going to talk more about Whitehawk, more about Brighton, and more about football in general. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Mark Doidge. Mark, just before the break, we were chatting about Whitehawk. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of the work you've done with them and then further afield as well?
Yeah, I mean, Whitehawk has made me fall in love with football again. I'll be learning a lot about football, particularly sort of really getting engaged with how football operates, the politics, the economics of it. It sort of made me fall a bit out of love. And I was falling out of love anyway. I'd given up my season ticket at Plymouth Argyle about the same sort of time, just before I started my PhD. So it's sort of a similar sort of move. And then coming back to watching football, particularly at the grassroots level, at the sort of non-league level, it felt more like what football should be about. And again, I know this is social construction and my own nostalgia, but we've got some great players at Whitehawk, and you get to know them, and you get to know them by name, and they get to know you, and you get to know the different members of the club, and you feel that you've actually got a voice within the club, and you can have a say, because say there's 300 or 400 people there. So your voice matters a little bit more than when there's 40 or 50,000 of you in a stadium. So engaging with football in this way really, I think, brings back the love of the game, brings back a sense of community, a sense of belonging, that this is just a nice, friendly place to be. And to a certain extent, that's sort of where a lot of my research is sort of heading towards, is, okay, how do we nurture or understand this a little bit clearer? How do we try and understand that sense of belonging, maybe more of the emotions that one feels when one goes to football? Because football is a hugely emotional experience. It's a real sense of belonging. It becomes a sense of oneself. We say we won at the weekend, or how did you do at the weekend? Oh yeah, we won. No, we didn't. I didn't kick a ball. I wouldn't be allowed anywhere near that pitch. In fact, the only time I've been on that pitch is when there was a pitch invasion at the end of a season when we got to the playoffs. But that's as close as I'm going to get. But we have that emotional oneness and sense of self by being connected to that broader collective that is football, broader identity that is football. And something we explored in the Ultras book was about those emotions and about the collective effervescence of what Durkheim would say, of lots of people coming together in this ritualistic fashion and anticipating and enjoying the moments of football. And that's something that I've been very interested in and definitely want to explore in the future. But I think there's also something about Whitehawk, that sense of community and how a group of fans can present a very positive image, that I think is something that I also am exploring and continuing to explore. So we're starting to see this replicated in other places. So Football Supporters Association, for example, has a Fans for Diversity group, and they work with various fan groups, LGBTQ plus groups, groups of ethnic minorities, groups of female fans who maybe don't feel that their voice is necessarily heard within the traditional football space, but are no less football fans than anyone else. And this idea that you can come together and still enjoy the game in a safe environment is actually something really beneficial and positive. That's definitely something that I'm more interested in and I've been working on more closely recently.
Right, and I know you're doing some extra work aside from Whitehawk as well, right?
Yeah, so most recently I've been doing some work away from football. I've been also interested in the role sport can play with refugees. So I did a project funded by Sport England with Brighton Table Tennis Club, which is sort of the perfect image of what a sports club could be and what sort of Whitehawk is trying to be as a football club as well, which is about being this inclusive, fun community space. Brighton Table Tennis Club started working with refugees about 5-6 years ago, and that's when they approached me and I started working with them just to understand, okay, how can they work closely with vulnerable groups like refugees, but they equally work with traveller community, with older people, with people recovering from cancer, people with Down syndrome or physical or mental disabilities, people coming out of prison. And what you realise is that when you're working with a group that is marginalised, when you work with them in mind, you're actually working with everyone in mind, because the things you put in place that makes that club welcoming for that particular group actually is just something positive for everyone that comes through the door. And Brighton Table Tennis Club is a really good, perfect example of a community club. It's been great to be able to work with these type of organisations like Brighton Table Tennis Club and Whitehawk FC, who are positive, inclusive, and fun places to be. And I think that's something that we forget about with sport, is that it should be fun. It should be about coming along to have fun, meet your mates, and enjoy yourself. And often too much, it becomes about beating your personal best, or we've got to win this game, otherwise it becomes, we're not going to go up, or we're going to go down. But actually, you could just enjoy the moments for what they are, which is people kicking a football or hitting a tennis ball around.
Yeah, I mean, it essentially goes back to what sport and clubs should be about, isn't it? I always try and say this to my fellow Brighton fans when Brighton yet again lose. It's like, well, if you only want to watch a team win, don't support Brighton, let's be honest, So community and sport should be about a hell of a lot more than just the winning and losing.
Absolutely. I think we come back to the roots of what sport actually is. What do we mean by sport? And so much of what sport has become in recent years has been this hyper-commodified media vehicle, which is only the best, only elite, invariably only elite men playing, and a smaller number of clubs. And for most people, sport is about winning, potentially. But for most football fans, you're never going to win every game. Unless you are Man United, Liverpool, maybe Arsenal, Spurs, now Chelsea, Man City, you've got histories of not winning very much. Yeah. I didn't start supporting Plymouth Argyle because they were winning things. Well, I started watching them in 1986 when we got promoted from Division 3, but you quickly realise that is a one-off. It doesn't happen it doesn't happen it happens every 10 years probably there's a promotion. That's usually because there's a relegation somewhere in between there. And for most fans, that's the case. And that's fine, because what it is you're going to enjoy yourself. Maybe you celebrate the victories, and those moments of despair come into sort of stark contrast when you win or you score a goal. And I can remember going to watch Argyle play Swansea back in the late 90s, and Argyle hadn't won away from home for like a year or two. And it's only because my youngest brother was at Cardiff Uni that I went to the game. And we were 2-0 down at half time. And so here we go. And then somehow we managed to win the game 3-2. Those moments stick in my memory. Why? Because it's against all the odds. And that's what being a football fan's about, is those stories, those memories, not necessarily, oh, we've won again and we've won again and we've won again. And for some people, sport is purely about elite men competing at the highest level that they can possibly do, with any amount of conditioning, pharmaceutical products, possibly nutritionists masseurs and all this to make them work the best. But actually, for a lot of people, it's just having a kick about with their mates in the park. It's going and watching their local team. And many, many more football fans watch lower league football, League One, League Two, non-league football, then watch the Premier League, then go to the Premier League matches, and yet all of the resources go to those top teams. So, yeah, it's about showcasing how, for most people, it's localised, it's community-based. Most football is put on by volunteers. There are thousands of people across Britain on a Saturday at 3:00 who are putting on a game, devoting their own time, and they're the ones that we celebrate, or should celebrate. But obviously all the focus goes on the Premier League.
And you mentioned inclusivity. I think in the time that I've been watching football, it's got better, but still you would notice that the majority of grounds that it is predominantly white, predominantly male in terms of fans. What do you think needs to happen to encourage more females to come to watch a game, or ethnic minorities, or whoever it may be, to get that more inclusivity at stadiums?
It's a really important point. I think it's very important at this moment in time when Black Lives Matter is in the media and people are taking it seriously. And the backlash is starting but hasn't quite started. But we're still seeing, even with Black Lives Matter being prominent in the media, Wilfred Zaha received racist abuse at the weekend, sent by a 12-year-old boy. We are seeing racist abuse being sent to black footballers on social media on a regular occasion. We've just had a year where England players were racially abused in Bulgaria. There were far-right, fascist elites there. We had players walk off the pitch, Haringey Borough or Wingate and Finchley, against Yeovil Town, the FA Cup in October last year, because the goalkeeper and one of the players were racially abused by a fan in the stadium. And the idea that racism has gone away from football is clearly a myth. And of course, what most of the media focus on when they talk about racism is it's a rude word, or a word that shouldn't be said. But we still have systemic racism within football, where there are very few black managers. So bearing in mind the number of players that have managed to make it through, particularly from the 80s and 90s onwards, and yet how few of them have made it into management despite having their coaching credentials, how few of them are in administrative roles within the FA, within the Premier League, within their clubs, how many are club directors. And this is part of the issue. So when we talk about racism, so often football likes to say, oh, it's just fans or maybe other players saying something, whereas actually it's a whole set of practices and processes that are actually excluding people. And that's equally true of females within the game. So, I mean, it's much, both of these cases, there are clear examples where black and female players have been excluded. So I'll bring it back to Plymouth Argyle for a bit. Plymouth Argyle in the 1920s and 30s had a player called Jack Leslie, who was a white English mother and a black Jamaican father, scored bagfuls of goals for Argyle. And this is in the days before newspapers had photos, let alone colour photos. And England, or the FA and the England selectors, were looking around for a new striker, saw this guy scoring lots of goals in Plymouth, and invited him up to London for an England call-up. And then when he arrived, he was turned away. And as Jack Leslie himself said, it was because I was a coloured man. And he would have been the first black player to play for England, and was turned away in the 1920s because he didn't fit. The FA, equally in the same sort of period, banned women's football for 50 years. So women's football took off. They'd always been playing football, but particularly in the First World War, women were playing football because the men were fighting in Europe, and they were selling out, tens, 50s, thousands, and they were raising lots of money for charity. There's huge attendances, and the FA didn't like this because they were worried that they thought that women shouldn't be playing, but it was also worried about the men's game. And they banned women from playing on any FA-sanctioned pitch. So women's football was banned for 50 years. So there are these massive structural issues that have taken place that continue to have legacies down the line. But there's also something we can say about the atmosphere around football matches. There is a certain image of some type of football fans, which is quite aggressive masculinity, which has its place, but equally that can be off-putting to certain people. And it's also hard when confronted with racism or sexism or homophobia in the terraces to actually be able to go, actually, come on, and it's actually quite difficult. And I'll be honest, as a young man, I would have found it really difficult I did find it difficult to sort of challenge that, because you don't know if you're going to be met with violence yourself. But it is getting better, and stewards are getting better educated and better trained. And that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work from the clubs to say, actually, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we make our club a safe environment. To a certain extent, that's why I'm sort of more inclined that come to the lower leagues, because it's more about what football should be. I think you're closer to the pitch, you're closer to the players, but also if there is an issue, it's actually in the club's interest to get rid of it quite quickly. And there's certain clubs, and Whitehawk being a great example, where it's part of the ethos of the fans to welcome everyone anyway. And it's finding those sort of clubs where you go, well, actually, okay, I'm a female fan, I'm going to be welcome there, rather than going into a space where it's like, am I going to be welcomed? This is going to be uncomfortable. Will I feel like I belong, even though I love the game? And for that reason, a lot of women are watching women's football because they don't get that toxicity. And I think that's an important thing, is that this football has to address that. But then there's other clubs locally. So Lewes FC, which is another local club, which is about 15 miles outside of Brighton. They have a very prominent women's team. They're the first club to pay their men and women's team equally. And they've actively worked hard to promote different fans to come to their games, including women who might never have been to football before, and a lot of their fans have maybe never been to football before, but they're enjoying being there and enjoying the experience.
Yeah, I've actually heard that from a few people who go to Lewes games and Whitehawk games, actually, that they weren't a football fan before they went to those two grounds, which is really encouraging.
Definitely. And I think I hear that a lot as well. And that's the biggest barrier I have, getting some people up to Whitehawk, because they go, oh, I don't like football. You go, the football's irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, that's irrelevant, yeah.
Have a beer on the terraces, and have a sing-song and beer on the terraces, the football. Yeah. What do you think of, Mark, just that maybe this could be the final question, because I think one of the ways that maybe football can work towards that inclusivity is kind of the German model, where the fans own the clubs, or certainly a certain percentage. Do you think that's the way football needs to go? Absolutely.
COVID has highlighted just how fragile, A, the economy is, and B, football is. You realise that fans haven't really been included in any conversations about football coming back. We see the media say, oh, football's back. No, the Premier League and the Championship are back, i.e. men's elite football is back.
Yes.
For most people, football isn't back. And what is football? Is football 11 men against 11 on a football pitch somewhere, or is it fans watching a game with them and part of the spectacle? And we're seeing with the TV companies trying to put in fan noise, because they realise that the fan experience at home isn't that exciting without fans in the stadium. So fans are an integral part of what I consider to be football. It's not just people kicking a ball about, is actually fans engaging and interacting with what's taking place on the pitch as well. So with the potential crisis that's going to hit football, because many clubs will start running out of money. We've already seen Bury go out of business this year. Wigan's currently in administration. We are hopefully going to have a conversation about what should football look like, and what should the governance of football look like. And within that conversation, there should be a conversation more along the lines of what happens in Germany. So the German model is called the 50+1 rule. And this is where members of the club own 50% plus one share of the club. So it means that no private company can now take over the club. There are some notable exemptions from that. Wolfsburg and Bayer Leverkusen both are historic club teams of the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company and the Volkswagen factory. So because they had long-standing connections, they were given exemptions. There's also a couple of other weird examples. So RB Leipzig, for example, has a small number of members who all happen to be owners, high-ranking employees of Red Bull, the sport drink manufacturer. And they tried to change the name to Red Bull Leipzig. That was banned by the Bundesliga. And they changed the name to Rasenball, which means lawn ball, but it means RB, so RB. And they changed the club colours to the colours of Red Bull, and the badge looks like the Red Bull logo. So there are ways around it. So there's some exemptions. Hoffenheim also has a lot of money pumped in a similar way from the owner of SAP, a software company. But most clubs are owned by members. And in most cases, the membership fees are relatively low so that the average fan can be a member and therefore has a say in how the club is run. And that, I think, translates into why football fans in Germany are a little bit more activist than, say, in Britain, because they actually have a say in their clubs and how they're run. Whereas the shift in Britain has been from fans being part of the club to becoming customers and becoming consumers. And therefore, if you treat fans as customers, then the implication is when things aren't going right, they won't come to the match, which is a very different form of activism. And most fans don't engage with things like that. They still want to be fans. They still want to engage, but we don't have the same voices to influence the directors or the boards to change things. And actually, any conversation about rebuilding football after COVID has to include how do you get the fans' voices into the boardrooms so that they have a say.
Yeah, it's got to happen. Whether it will, I don't think it will, but maybe at the lower level at least.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, and this is what I mean. In lower leagues, fans can have a little bit more of a voice just because they become more important. You don't get lost in a global fan base with massive media packages that pay most of your revenue, whereas at the lower league, virtually all of your income comes from people coming through the gate. So if you piss them off, then you don't have much money coming in. So hopefully at the lower leagues it can happen.
Thank you, Mark. Could I ask you just to finish before we sign off, let people know how they could get in touch or read more about your work, please?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, so it's at Mark Doidge, MarkDoidge. I also have, if you search Mark Doidge, University of Brighton, my uni page comes up, which has a list of my publications and my books. Feel free to email me if you've got any questions. I'm always happy to engage with people and have a conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Mark. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for asking me, Matthew.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.